Today's world has no shortage of mass political movements, from violent ones like the armed struggle of Syrian rebels against their government to nonviolent forms of resistance like the million Britons who protested Brexit on the streets of London earlier this year. Here in the United States, and just since Trump's inauguration in 2017, millions of Americans have marched for issues like women's rights, greater gun control, LGBTQ rights, and for action on climate change. Why are all these movements coinciding? Why are some forms of resistance violent, others nonviolent, and which ones tend to work out in the end? This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji, and today we're pleased to have political scientist Dr. Erica Chenoweth, a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and an expert on political violence and civil resistance. Erica, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start out with the basics. What is civil resistance? How is that distinguished from political violence?
Yeah, so civil resistance is a method of conflict where people who don't have weapons actively confront an opponent or an oppressor using a variety of different coordinated and well-sequenced techniques like strikes, boycotts, protests, go slow, stay-at-homes, etc. And they're doing this in a way that's active, confrontational, disruptive, and meant to create some kind of major political transformation or economic social transformation without doing physical harm to the opponent. So that sounds like a pretty abstract definition, but you might think of a lot of the examples that you mentioned in the intro as kind of prototypes of a civil resistance movement where people are essentially engaging in some form of collective action, but without violence. And it's different from political violence because political violence does attempt to do physical harm to the opponent, to either engage in an attrition strategy where you're wearing down their infrastructure, to engage in different kind of provocation strategies where you're trying to provoke an overreaction and therefore elicit greater participation or sympathy from the population you say you represent. But all of the things that tie political violence together is violence. That is to say, it's the use of methods that directly harm an opponent in order to create the outcome you want.
So why would anyone be nonviolent when they can be violent? Because don't people respect violence and power and militarism a little bit more than nonviolent resistance?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an open question. There is a lot of debate about whether people essentially are driven to use violence or whether they choose to use violence. And I think I'm more on the side of understanding the choice of using nonviolent resistance or violent resistance as something that people essentially decide to do rather than are forced to do, at least when we talk about it in a collective nature. So there's one kind of important qualification to this response, which is that sometimes if we're talking about the individual level of analysis, which a lot of people will use as sort of the straw man argument, what if somebody comes running at you with a knife? What are you going to do? That's a very different set of questions than what happens when people get together to collectively mobilize in trying to create a political transformation.
You're talking about mass movements here. That's what we're talking about.
Exactly.
And is there one that is better or worse? I mean, does it depend totally on the circumstances?
Yeah, so in my research with Maria Stephan anyway, we found that there are very few structural conditions that preclude the use of nonviolent resistance or that make it so that it would be less effective. Now, of course, it's always harder to mobilize any form of collective action in highly repressive, authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, but our argument is essentially that it's hard to mobilize any form of resistance, including violent resistance in such settings, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's harder to do nonviolent than violent action, or that nonviolent action would be any less likely to succeed.
So it still takes courage to do either one. You're still having to rise up against some repressive government of some sort.
Yeah, and I think one of the key myths about nonviolent action is that it's somehow passive or it's somehow pacifistic. Or that it's based on this notion of submission or letting people do harm to a group of people. But actually, nonviolent action is about fighting back. It's just fighting back using a series of methods that have proven to be far more effective, at least in the past 120 years of recorded human history, than organized armed rebellion.
How much does volume matter? Because I feel like when I talk really loud, people tend to believe me.
Yeah, I think the best analog to volume for nonviolent movements is mass, which is to say, how many people can you get to show up? One of the key findings from our book, Why Civil Resistance Works, is that numbers really matter. The higher the participation rates, the more likely a campaign is to succeed. That's true for nonviolent or violent resistance. It's just that nonviolent campaigns tend to get far more people involved than the average violent movement, something like 11 times larger as a proportion of the population in general.
Is it just less intimidating? That's why people are more likely to sign up for a nonviolent campaign?
A lot of nonviolent methods are more inclusive just by their nature. For example, stay-at-homes and sit-ins don't require able-bodied people. They just require people to participate. Many nonviolent methods are deliberately meant to be physically easy for people to participate, accessible and visible so that people know how to participate. And many nonviolent techniques don't require people to sort of turn their backs on their whole lives and become fugitives. They just require people to go out and be kind of casually involved. But it turns out when many hundreds of thousands or millions of people become casually involved, that has a really disruptive effect on the polity.
And so you referenced your book with Bria Stephan, which is Why Civil Resistance Works, and it's the strategic logic of nonviolent conflict. And this was published in 2011 and won a bunch of awards. And what you say is that actually civil resistance can work. The nonviolent resistance actually does produce outcomes. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So first, we would argue that civil resistance doesn't always work, but it just works better than the violent alternatives. And it certainly fails a lot of the time. And when we drill down into the data to try to figure out what explains that variation, what we basically find is that nonviolent campaigns tend to be larger. Their size tends to allow them to elicit loyalty shifts within the regime's pillars of support. So the security forces, economic and business elites, civilian bureaucrats, people just stop wanting to cooperate with the regime when it looks like millions of people have withdrawn their consent from being governed by it. So if you look at the events of Sudan in April, for example, the Sudan uprising, the larger that movement became, the more we started to see the military split and defect. This is a common outcome of very large, sustained mobilizations in different countries. And those types of defections can then kind of herald the end of the regime as it currently is configured. The other thing that nonviolent campaigns can often do that violent campaigns have a tough time with is that they're very good with tactical innovation because the larger a campaign is, the more it can avail itself of the creativity and innovation of different people who are participating. So that means they can shift and maneuver between, say, protests and strikes when repression starts to escalate. And they also are much more likely to be able to avail themselves of a backfiring effect of repression. So one sort of general pattern we find is that when repression happens against unarmed people, it is much more likely to elicit even more mobilization and outrage of what's seen as a moral excess. Whereas when repression takes place against armed insurgents, those effects are not found.
Do you think it takes the same courage? Intuitively to me, it takes more courage to be a nonviolent protester in a repressive environment than a violent protester because you don't actually have something to immediately protect your immediate environment. Do you think that's right?
I don't know if I would compare the incidence of courage, but I would say that I think it's more difficult to be disciplined in those environments. It's easier to think, maybe, that violence is required to defend oneself against violence. And in fact, that may be true at a micro level, but it doesn't scale, right? So once you get into an organization, or you get into a collective, it's much safer to not be violent, even if you're engaging in highly contentious, disruptive activities.
How many people, with these successful civil resistance campaigns, how many people does it take to achieve your goals, to start a revolution, to succeed, I guess, in the revolution?
Yeah, so up until about 2006, it looked like the critical threshold was about 3.5% of the national population. Since then, it looks like there might be a couple of cases that went above that 3.5% rule. For example, in Bahrain, there are some estimates that say there were about 7% of the population, and that campaign did not succeed in 2011, 2012. There's another case in Venezuela. Some people have argued that they surpassed or came very close to the 3.5%, but that campaign has not yet succeeded, at least right now as we're recording. But basically, the number seems to be somewhere between 3.5% and 5%, that people feel pretty confident in saying no government can really withstand a challenge of that size.
And that's a full mobilization of those folks. That's not just saying we have support from 3 to 5%, which is a pretty low number if from just a, in terms of votes or from that perspective. But we're talking about full mobilization, dropping whatever they're doing and taking to the streets.
That's right. So if you think about what that would entail in the United States, for example, with a population our size, you're looking at 11.5, 12 million people. So take the first Women's March, which was the largest single-day mobilization in U.S. history, with probably about 4.2 million people. Multiply it by about 2.5, and that's what we're looking at.
Yeah, so that's if Donald Trump had also Eric Trump maybe be his, or Don Jr. be his vice president, then maybe we would see those kind of numbers. Is that what we're saying?
Well, it's hard to know what creates those moments around which people will engage in mass mobilization. It seems to be quite idiosyncratic. But there is always some process that Doug McAdam calls cognitive liberation, which is a process that seems to happen collectively when people realize enough is enough, and they must act, and they can't stop until the day has won. Yeah. So, whether the United States has sort of reached that moment or not is, I think, still contested.
Well, let's talk about the United States. So we've seen a lot of these things happening at the same time. And your last book, or not your last book, you've written many books, but the one that we just referenced with Maria Stephan, the 2011 book on civil resistance, that went up to 2006, as you referenced. And we've had 12 years since, and a lot has happened since we had the Tea Party. We've had Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, all these things. Is there a line you can draw? Do we look at the Tea Party differently than we did at the time now, knowing what kind of world we're in? Is there a connection between all this stuff that's happening?
Yeah. So I think there's definitely a connection, because globally we see more mass nonviolent campaigns in this decade than we have in any other decade since 1900. So we know that there's a ton going on, and that people are turning to nonviolent resistance as the primary mode of waging their conflicts and resolving their conflicts. So the Tea Party was, it's sort of a middle-of-the-road case for a couple of reasons. The first is that they really weren't extra institutional. The Tea Party called themselves a Tea Party, but they worked through electoral institutions and civic organizations to mobilize an electoral victory that swept states, Congress, and the presidency. So that's a little bit different from a movement that is operating entirely outside of the channels of institutionalized power, because they reject them as inadequate or corrupted. So because of that, it's actually often harder to mobilize long-term, large-scale civil resistance in democracies, because the bar for what you have to actually do to operate outside the system is a bit higher. Protest, for example, is very normalized in most advanced democracies. It's protected by the institutions in most cases.
Shouldn't that make it easier then?
It is easier, but it's harder to sustain a challenge because it's not very transgressive. And so, a lot of people will go and protest, but it's sort of symbolic, and then they go home.
Yeah, they have their channel. It's a release, and now they can kind of go on with their lives. Is that the idea?
Yeah, the idea is that basically it's become so normalized that it's basically equivalent to blowing off steam, but where people really exercise, or what they think they exercise, their political powers at the voting booth. Yeah. Right? So there's a confidence in elections as sort of resolving major political conflicts.
It's so hard to get passionate about elections, isn't it?
Yeah, but
in the same way?
It is, but actually, most of the mobilizational capacity goes into campaigns, right? Every 2 years in the United States. So you can get a big protest movement going and a social movement off the ground, but then a lot of times the energy is channeled into the institutions. Whereas in authoritarian regimes, where you don't have that level of consistency around institutional redress, it's actually paradoxically easier to convince people that in order to make the change, they have to continue engaging in this extra institutional civil resistance.
Do you have a favorite form of civil resistance?
I don't know that I have a favorite form of it. I have a technique that I often think is very interesting, which is the silent march, when used as a way to try to create discipline within a campaign when people are really angry. So one of the interesting examples of this took place in Nashville during the desegregation campaign there, during the Civil Rights Movement. And what had happened is there was a prominent black lawyer in Nashville who was defending a lot of the students who had engaged in lunch counter sit-ins and had been arrested and imprisoned. And his home was bombed. And there was so much anger about his targeting that there was a quickly organized 5,000 person strong silent march. And the reason it was silent was both to dramatize the injustice of the situation and also to make sure that people didn't hurl insults as they walked by the other people in Nashville. So they were so angry that they used the silence as a way to make sure the event stayed nonviolent. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that's my favorite technique of nonviolent action, but it really helps to see how nonviolent action can creatively channel a moment that could otherwise have gone south really quickly, in the sense that the outrage could have then led to a scene of chaos that then hurt the movement's political effects, and was channeled into this kind of brilliant moment that ended up being the most powerful moment in that campaign in many respects, because the marchers actually confronted the mayor on the steps of City Hall and demanded to know whether he agreed that it was morally right for people to be deprived of service based on the color of their skin in their downtown shopping areas. And him facing 5,000 silent people staring at him, of course, had to say, yes, it's morally wrong, right? And that was the key moment that then got the man on record, that then created all these ripple effects that desegregated downtown Nashville.
That is remarkable. How do you think about white nationalism in the United States? Is it on the rise? And relative to this conversation about silent marches, of course, there in Charlottesville a year and a half ago was not very silent. It was violent, but they also, I mean, they were carrying around guns, but they were also not, they were not violent in the sense that that was a, it seemed to be that they wanted to intimidate with the guns, but they weren't expecting to use them. How do you think about that kind of movement right now and where it's going?
Well, white nationalism is an ideology, and it's hard for us to know whether it's on the rise, right, in terms of the ideological prominence. It's hard to know whether there are more believers now than there were 10 years ago, for example. But we do know that expressions of white nationalism are on the rise, and those are expressed both nonviolently and violently. Many people say that if your ideology actually includes the perpetuation of structural violence or direct violence against other people, you can't be a nonviolent movement. Right. So that's sort of a conceptual set of arguments. I wouldn't call the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville a nonviolent event. Mm-hmm. I think carrying open weapons into a protest where you know there are going to be counter-protesters and you're deliberately stoking and provoking and kind of trying to engage in street fights. There were actually active street fights, and there was, of course, an attack against protesters that resulted in a fatality and numerous injuries. That was a violent event, both in terms of the quality of it and the actual observational outcome of it. So, you know, I think I view with very much concern the rise in hate crimes and the rise in terror attacks by white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists here in the United States and abroad. I think it's a global movement. It's very similar to earlier manifestations of global networks of extremist ideologues who connect with one another and kind of encourage each other to engage in acts of violence where they live. We saw examples of this at the turn of the 20th century with a global network of anarchist, anti-monarchists and anti-democrats, essentially. And then we saw it again with the rise of the global Salafi jihadi movement in the 1980s and beyond. And now we're seeing it with the rise of a kind of global white supremacist, white nationalist network.
It just sort of seems, when I think of civil resistance, I think of liberalism. I think of democracy. I think of left-leaning progressive ideals. But in a vacuum, it's not. It's a form of resistance that could be used by any type of group. Are we seeing this form of resistance? I mean, in the last 12 years since the book with Maria Stephan, as we talked about, has that form been on the rise, and is it just as effective as it has always been?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, as you say, civil resistance is an empty category of human behavior in the sense that anybody can use it for any reason. And whether it's effective or not kind of depends on how many people you can convince to join you, right? And so in deeply polarized societies, which it looks like is an increasing phenomenon itself, we're much more likely to see people using civil resistance on many different kind of sides of an ideological fight. And there are cases, certainly, that we've observed in the past where groups have used nonviolent action to support anti-liberal or anti-democratic aims, even before this current moment. So, for example, there have been pro-royalist and anti-democratic movements in Thailand that were sort of back and forth between elected prime ministers and military regimes and royalist regimes, et cetera. The movement that supported the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil was a conservative nonviolent mass movement. I mean, they had a large coalition at the time. She was pretty unpopular by the time she was impeached by the Brazilian Congress. But that movement really then was galvanized and became even more kind of right-wing and is very much connected with the movement that has put Bolsonaro in power. So, yes, civil resistance can be and often has been used for anti-democratic aims. And for me, the question is, why do people feel anti-democratic right now? Less so than whether civil resistance somehow animates or empowers those groups.
Is there some kind of, maybe a checklist is too blunt of a way of putting it, but are there criteria, common threads you see across these successful movements? You mentioned inclusiveness, but inclusiveness seems to be a feature, a characteristic of nonviolence. Are there other sorts of forms that you've seen that have been particularly effective?
Yeah, so there are basically four things that I look for when I'm watching an ongoing movement to see whether I think it's going to tip over into success or not. The first is large numbers. The second is whether the campaign is able to sustain and grow those numbers. And the third is whether they're able to get support from other actors that used to be aligned with the regime. So especially security force defections are really important because they usually will preclude mass repression that could demobilize the movement. There's also the question of whether they're only relying on demonstrations and protests or if they've broadened out into other forms of non-cooperation, particularly the strike, which is a much more powerful technique. And then the question of whether they're able to maintain discipline if repression does begin to increase. If they basically meet those criteria, they're movements that are much more likely to succeed.
But some movements change over time, right? So do you think about those different? So say, and I'm sure you know many more examples than I do, but how do you code those? How do you think about those?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways to deal with it. One is to sort of see a change over time as a phase shift. So some movements start out as nonviolent movements and then they shift to violent or they adopt some violence in a routine way. So the way I classify these are either as primarily nonviolent with a violent flank or a movement that used to be nonviolent that's now primarily violent. And it is definitely the case that movements that go from nonviolent to violent tend to not be as successful as movements that remain nonviolent. The only campaign I can think of where it seems like there was a genuine political benefit of moving from nonviolent to violent was Kosovo, the Kosovo independence movement. But the only reason that worked for that campaign is because there were powerful international actors that supported and, in fact, even intervened on behalf of the nonviolent movement, of the violent movement, to force Milosevic to essentially agree to the separation of Kosovo. And there were many costs to that intervention in terms of human life and kind of the long-term political future of Kosovo relative to its neighbors and other powerful rivals. But I think that is a single case of hundreds where I can actually see a reasonable argument that the violence helped them get what they wanted, but at a great cost.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking too long and not eating enough, so we're gonna move to the cashews. Now, your favorite snack is salted cashews, I had to give you two options: home roasted,
very nice,
home seasoned. These are herbed, salted roasted cashews with some herbs herb de Provence and sage, and these are just your standard. Feel no pressure, but
I'm very impressed. This is a very nice selection, and I'm impressed that you roasted them yourself.
So no, have at it, please. So cashews are your favorite. Is that because cashews are the most nonviolent snack in your opinion?
No. I don't know why they're my favorite. I think it's because they're sweet and salty at the same time. And they're very satisfying.
They're very satisfying.
They're much easier to chew than an almond. An almond gets squeaky, which is annoying.
Gets squeaky?
Yeah, it gets squeaky when you chew it,
As in it like
between your teeth.
Between your teeth, right.
Yeah.
Wow.
It bothers me. And peanuts are just a little too small. So cashew is perfect.
Right. It's also, it's used as you grind cashews with water as a kind of creaming. Like it can make sauces. Certainly in Indian food,
Yeah.
You can make sauces creamier with a cashew.
Yeah. Some people drink it as milk, which is fantastic.
Cashew milk. Now there's a big debate about whether or not you can call like almond milk, cashew milk, oat milk. Right. The milk lobby, as far as I understand the news, is very much anti new forms of milk. They want to call them juice. What is your opinion?
I did not know that. I did not know that. But I will tell you that I have long questioned and speculated with friends of mine on road trips why it is that cashews are such superior nuts.
Really?
So I'm not alone in my
There are other people who agree with you.
Yeah.
What about Brazil nuts?
I don't eat as many of those, but I know people who are really allergic to them. So
this is more democratic.
I guess so. More inclusive.
As someone in academia, do you sometimes just kind of want to get out there and protest as well? Because you study these things, right? You study you study people making just passionate actions, calls for action and protests and citizen, all this sort of stuff. What about you?
Well, I used to kind of think of myself as an astronomer rather than an astronaut in this regard. And at this point, I have and do participate in protest and resistance when I can. Because, there are some things that I think necessitate people to ask themselves what they were doing in key moments of history. And there are things that I think are really worth standing up for, and I want to do that. I don't want to do nothing when things are happening.
Have you always been that way, or is that something that was catalyzed by the last couple of years? I know many peers of mine, and myself included, haven't expressed ourselves politically in the same way as we have in the last 2 years.
Yeah. I think it started a little before the last couple of years, in part because I was really motivated and inspired by Black Lives Matter, I became really, my mind changed about a lot of things, about the United States and about race. You know, what happened is one of the people that I was really learning from who was engaged in that movement kind of said, you know, when white people in positions of power don't say anything or do anything in times when Black people in this country are rising up, the silence is deafening. And I started to really change my mind about what my responsibilities are as just a person who lives here.
As a citizen.
As a citizen, as somebody who is concerned about the future of our country and the well-being of everyone in it. And so basically I started to become more interested in activism myself during that time, and then it's accelerated in the last couple of years.
It's kind of exhilarating, isn't it? I mean, I don't know. You hesitate to say you call it fun, or because it comes from a place of concern, but the idea of being able to express yourself politically, there's kind of an element of being a part of a larger movement that is exciting.
Yeah, Elizabeth Wood calls this the pleasure of agency, but there is a sense of collective kind of efficacy and participation in a movement with others, I think, is an important responsibility when there's something really unjust taking place. And when we get to show up in that way, it's humbling and it's an opportunity not to be missed.
And tell us, you've got a book coming out in 2020 that you're working on. Sort of a handbook, it seems like, for civil resistance, learning about civil resistance. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so this book is called Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, and it's in a series called What Everyone Needs to Know that Oxford University Press carries. But basically what the idea is to create an accessible, conversational introduction to a topic. And in this case, what I want to do is just write a book about what I've essentially learned about civil resistance from both studying it and learning from others who study it and who engage in it, about the phenomenon over the past 10 or so years, and give people a look at global trends, what they mean, and really what they need to know if they are observing this or if they're participating in it.
Great. Well, that sounds like it'll be a wonderful resource to have. Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Aroop.
Yeah. This is Snack Break. I'm Aroop Mukharji. Today we had Dr. Erica Chenoweth, a professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. To view more episodes, please visit our website at snackbreakshow.com.